right, so I will give, I could go on and on introducing Dr. Lipsett-Rivera, who I've known for many years, but we'll just say a few things. She is from Ottawa, Canada. She graduated from the University of Ottawa, then went to Tulane for her PhD. She now teaches at Carleton University in Ottawa, so she was fortunate to get back to her home city. It doesn't always work out that way, but sometimes it does. She's published a lot. Her first book was on To Defend Our Water, so on the history of water rights in Mexico. Her second book was Gender and the Navigation of Daily Life. She's edited a number of books, and of course her most recent book, The Origins of Macho, that she will be talking about today. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Lipsett-Rivera with us today, and let's welcome her with a hand.
Well, I'd like to thank Jeff Shumway for inviting me here, and I guess the institution for making it possible. I'd also just like to say that this is a day, at least in Canada, I'm sure here too, where we honor men who have served and who gave their lives. And so I just wanted to mention that, you know, I want to thank you for coming on such a day, because sometimes it's a day when we don't do anything. Okay, so I thought that I would talk a little bit about how this project got started first. So this is my last book, Gender, the Negotiation of Daily Life. And so it's a book about gender relations. And I was primarily interested in women for this book. But of course, men were a big part of it, because there's always interactions between men and women. And when I finished reading the book, I thought, well, yeah, I kind of understand a lot. But I didn't understand a lot of the things that happened when men were interacting with other men. That seemed really mysterious. And there was one incident that really mystified me. So I'll just tell you about it. So it was in a small town in Mexico called Tenancingo in 1799. There's a group of people who were having a little house party. There was a guitar, and they were singing, and they were drinking. And people came in and so forth. And in another part of the town, these two friends were walking around, and their names were Casiano and Juan. And they heard this party, and they go and they stand at the door. And the people inside say, "Oh, come on in." And for some reason, they found that really insulting. And they said, "We are not libertines, so we will not go in." And of course, there was a fight, people were wounded, and it entered into the documentary record. And I just found this so extraordinary. Now, in Mexico, as you probably know, there's this strong sense of hospitality. Mexicans will always say, "Mi casa es tu casa," my house is your house, and they will go to great lengths, and they're incredibly hospitable. And so why was hospitality insulting? Why is an invitation a slur on your morality? So I thought, well, let's find out. And so this is why I thought, let's look at Mexican men. And there's a stereotype of Mexican men. I thought I had gotten rid of these animations, but so the stereotype is that they're aggressive, they're proud, definitely womanizers, and the most important one is they're extremely violent. This stereotype and this idea of the Mexican macho is so common that I've even found references to the macho in books on ancient Greece, which seemed a little bit of a push. In fact, the word macho in the colonial period was not used to describe masculinity. It was used to describe male animals. So if you had a male pig or a male, it didn't describe masculinity. The usage of the word seems to start in the 20th century with the corridos of the Mexican Revolution, and then it becomes really common in the presidential campaign when Manuel Ávila Camacho was running for office, and his supporters would say macho, and then they would really emphasize the macho, and so that seems to have been when this word to describe Mexican masculinity began to be really common. Different philosophers, Samuel Ramos, Octavio Paz, also began to use codify this hypermasculine macho behavior, and they connected this behavior to Mexico's past. In particular, Octavio Paz talked about the rape of indigenous women and how that had connections to the development of a Mexican identity. Their ideas were also influential in the anthropologist Oscar Lewis, who had incredibly popular, I'm sure his most popular anthropological studies of all time. His studies sort of equated masculinity with machismo and emphasized the violence and the womanizing of Mexican men. So these studies were lauded. They also, this was codified in a lot of the Golden Age cinema, where some of the big Mexican stars kind of imbued this idea of the big talker, the womanizer, and so forth. So these ideas were present, and then Matthew Gutman, in I can't remember the year of his book, but he wrote this book called The Meanings of Macho, and it was the first time someone had really kind of looked at these stereotypes and said, maybe they're not quite true. And so in his book, he shows that a lot of men, even if they consider themselves macho, would look after the children, would do the cooking and the shopping, and so forth. So it was a really, really interesting corrective to the idea that machismo was, always practiced by Mexican men. But what was interesting when I read this book, when trying to figure out, what is it about men, is that there was really no historical scholarship on Mexican men. The only historical source he used was Sylvia Ramos' book on Mexican women. So clearly there was a big gap in the literature. So these were some of the ideas that informed my research. Now I decided to work in court documents because they are so much fun. And the period was quite a long one, but really most of the documents were from the 18th century and really the late 18th century. There were some fires and some problems in the archives, and in a way that made my task easier. There were fewer documents, but I did end up reading, along with research assistants, 569 judicial cases. Some of them really long, some of them really small. And what I was interested in was how men interacted with other men. So although these were court cases and there are crimes involved, of course, the crimes themselves were not what I was interested in, but was the descriptions of how men interacted and the explanations. And so I looked at Mexico City and the surrounding villages. And in this project, Latin American historians are always interested in sort of the racial makeup. It's really hard to say definitively what it was because we depend on the individuals to self-identify, and sometimes they just didn't. But the largest group of aggressive people were people described as Españoles, or people of Spanish descent or Spanish, and the largest group of victims of this aggression were indigenous. They tended to be middle to lower class. Very few of them had honorifics such as Don. But what united them is that they were caught up in some kind of altercation that got into the documents. Now, during this project, I came into it with certain ideas. In fact, I really thought it was going to be quite grim. And what surprised me is how not grim a lot of the research was. There was a lot of joking and funny things and little interesting details. So what I'd like to do now for the rest of my talk is to talk to you about the 4 surprises I had, which will kind of give you an idea of what I was doing. And then at the end, I'm going to go back to this idea of the Mexican macho and what, my explanation for where this comes from, or where this idea or this Mexican masculinity comes from. Okay. Oh, sorry. These are just some examples of the documents. So these are photographs I took. This is a funny one. So of course this is pre-CSI and so forth. So this is like the Mexican colonial version of CSI. You made a picture of the knife, and so sometimes they even had like, if they were very fancy, they would have like a little drop of blood on the end of the knife. And sometimes, there'd be like a nick in the knife, and this is documenting what weapon was used. These are confiscated cards. And you might wonder, why would cards be confiscated? Well, if they weren't the official cards that were sold by the Crown, they were illegal. And sometimes they were cards, card games that were not allowed. But they would actually be sewn into the documents. And this is a confiscated love letter. And I had hoped to use this in my book, but the picture wasn't of a high enough quality to use. But it was quite a sweet letter. Okay, so surprise number one. So we come into this thinking that men are going to be, the ideal will be violence. And actually the ideal for men, what they were supposed to aspire to, was emotional composure. In the documents, they would describe themselves as quiet, contained, peaceful. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back here. So this was my first sort of challenge, because in a sense, despite the fact that they were always trying to aspire to this and sort of just describe themselves in this way, there's a lot of violence. So how to explain this? So one of the ways I thought that to get out of this conundrum is a Chilean historian, Veronica Unduraga-Schuler, who points out that within the prevailing honor system, men would not accept a challenge from a man who is below them in stature. So the only time you could really have a fight, or a physical fight, is if it was between two men of the similar. And so in fact, by not accepting a challenge, you're actually insulting them even more. But there was a lot of violence. So one of the other ways that I could explain this was that when a man of higher status was violent with a man of lower status, they didn't see that as being violent. They saw that as disciplining them. And in fact, what they were doing was a very common thing within colonial societies, is that they're feminizing those men. And that's a very common thing. You'll see that in colonial studies. Very often indigenous men were feminized. And that is a way to sort of justify the violence and so forth. In fact, often when these men did this, they would describe it in a way that was very similar to the violence that they would very often impart on their wives. So when they were violent with their wives, they weren't being violent per se, they were disciplining them. And so that was an acceptable violence. And so it doesn't really take away from their emotional composure. Okay. So one of the things that I found when I was looking at these things is that actually a lot of the violence was sublimated. And in order to understand this, you have to understand a lot of the rules of etiquette. So one important part of etiquette was hats. I kind of wish people, that I wore a hat so I could demonstrate all this, but I haven't worn a hat in a really long time. But I think you could probably think about this. I see two young men, at least, wearing hats today, and one, oh, that's you. It's absolutely fine. But you probably, one is wearing it, baseball hat backwards, one is forward, and you might think about what that means. What are the messages that clothes and hats still convey? But in this period, there were rules about hats. Hats for the officials actually were channeling the king's authority, and so when they wore a hat, it was actually to show that they were in authority and that they kept it on because they were high status. Now, for people of lower ranks, the importance was not so much the hat, but taking off the hat. And so you had to doff your hat in greeting to another man. Now, interesting, I thought this was really odd. The polite thing to do for men in this period was to take off your hat when you greeted someone, but you didn't take off your hat when you came into the house. And I think that would be considered rude now. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, so what this ended up being is there's kind of a vocabulary of respect that comes through hats. Hats were also something that were intimately associated with men. In fact, when today, if there was somebody who committed a crime, we'd have some kind of description of them. In that period, people really described the clothes, and particularly for men, the hats, because people tended to wear the same clothes often, so they were very much identified with them. So respectable men never left the house without a hat, and their hats became what they were known for. So lower class men, when they got into trouble, when they spoke to the judges and so forth, they always said very emphatically, "I had my hat in my hand." And that is to say, I was being respectful. I don't know why this man hit me, because I was being respectful. I had my hat in my hand. And in a workplace, so for example, in the Royal Mint, the workers would always have to take off their hats whenever a supervisor came in. And one historian, Felipe Castro Gutierrez, talks about this as a ritual of submission and a kind of a code. And he actually said these ritualized gestures become a kind of mask. And so lower class men had to always be performing being humble and also submitting themselves to the authority of their supervisors. Now, conversely, when men did not take off their hat, this was a way to show contempt. So you can take those rules of politeness and then just turn them upside down. So it was a shorthand for insolence. So there are various incidents that I found. Two educated men who had the honorific of Don, and they were bachilleres. They meet in the street, and they don't really like each other, and one of them actually pushes his hat further on his head, and that's just to show, I really don't like you and I don't respect you. For lower class people, there's something that I like to call insolence by hat. There's a guy called Vicente El Paje, who was a vendor in the plaza in Mexico City, and he not only kept his hat firmly on his head in the presence of one of the officials, the market administrator, but he sort of adopted a swagger. He has a cigar in his mouth. And when ordered to take off his hat, he replied that in the matter of his hat, he took orders from no one. Of course, he got into a lot of trouble. And another occasion in 1808, and the year is important here, 1808 is very close to the time when Mexicans will declare for independence. And, there's a lot of stuff going on in Latin America. There was a royalist procession, and all those attending were shouting, "Long live the king!" There's an indigenous man called Ángel José Nuncial, and he refused to remove his hat. And another indigenous man reprimanded him, pointing out that he was insulting the monarch. And then, they attacked each other and so forth. So that was one of the first ways this was important. Surprise number 2 is homes, and oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. Now, homes and enclosure for men is something that historians haven't really emphasized until the 19th century. So there's a lot of work on domesticity amongst Victorian men. But what I found, and it was surprised me a lot, is that men found their homes to be a very important source of their own masculinity and morality. Now, gender historians for this period have usually divided up spaces. You know, the home is very feminine and women stay in the house. And I have said this in my books and my work too. So I am guilty of this. And then, you know, the outer spaces, the streets, the countryside are gendered masculine. And so when women go into those masculine spaces, they're often sexualized and so forth. So yeah, and I actually think this is still true, but there's another layer to it. And that is that, that men actually would talk about being recogido. So recogimiento is a concept that gender historians have used to describe how women would be enclosed. So so nuns are the prime example of this, that they're enclosed in the convent. But women themselves, especially upper class women, would describe themselves as recogidas, and it's a synonym for morality. We stay inside because we are moral. But what surprised me is that men sometimes when they were caught, so for example, in the 18th century, the officials began to round up men in the streets at night, and they would then, you know, they'd be accused of being vagrants, and they could be forced to go into the army or to other public works and so forth. So this was a serious thing. So one young man, Jose Antonio Guevara, was caught up in one of these patrols, and his family came in and his employer came in to defend him, and they said, no, he's a respectable man, and they especially said he's recogido, muy recogido. Men often, when they were accused of being immoral or they were arrested, they would emphasize that they were at home, and they would say, I was sleeping, I was engaged in domestic tasks, I was repairing things, I was praying, I was eating with my family, and most of all, you know, sleeping. Men found it really, the boundaries of their house were really important, and letting someone into the house was usually only somebody of trust, a very good friend, and sometimes those friends did things that were not very honorable. For example, seducing a daughter, and that would wound the head of the household to his core because he had let this person into his house. So control over homes was very important. So one of the things that is really important was about the doors. And so very often in cities, people lived in these big sort of mansions, but they were not necessarily luxurious places. There were a lot of, on the second floor there would be kind of, not apartments, but rooms, maybe several rooms, and people would rent them. And there's this one major door, so this is right here. And at night that was locked. So some men wanted to have control over that door, and so they were able to get keys to the door, and they often fought over this. And they really want control over this because they want control over who comes and goes. One of the things that I found, and so this is kind of from my last book, but it also enters into this book, is that there's this idea about when doors are supposed to be open and closed. So in the daytime, doors need to be open, and you open your doors to your rooms to show that you're moral, you have nothing to hide. But at night, they have to be closed to show that you're moral and you're not letting anyone into your rooms, and you know, people aren't coming and going. And so the symbolism of doors is really important. And so we see this when in cases where keys are taken away or locks are changed, and people get, you know, men get very upset about this. Or when, so for example, Don Jose Carriaga, who's a master silversmith, said that another uh, person, a glazier, was in the building, and he was allowing people in at night. And so this was actually affecting the first guy because his reputation was endangered because people were coming and going, and it was said that there's probably gambling going on. Maybe this guy was running the games, and so he was losing business. And so this lack of the idea of lack of morality really was important. Now, thresholds were also very important, and one of the things that's really common to read about in all these documents is that people would stand in their doors a lot. And at first I thought it was mostly women, but it was men too. And they stand in the door to see what's going on, to kind of know what's happening. But also because on the threshold, so if we think of the house as a moral space and the streets as kind of immoral, the threshold is that place where you can be in and out, and you're kind of on the edge of that. But it's also, the threshold is part of a kind of bubble that goes in front of the house, and you have to defend that bubble, if you can say that. Because to not defend it is to allow your household to be considered immoral. So I want to talk about this with two examples. One is in the village of Playa Capa in 1786. There was a procession, and so of course there are a lot of processions in colonial Mexico. All the saints' days and all the important religious holidays, they would have these lovely processions, and people, it was usually a day of rest, and so people would come out and they would enjoy it, and some of the processions were really fabulous. They would have they would have theater, and they would have costume people and dancers. Not all of them were that great, but they were pretty good. So in this particular one, this was a procession for the Holy Wednesday, honoring the local saint Nuestra Señora de los Dolores, one of the Virgin Mary, and so as was customary, people came out onto the street and to watch the procession, and the local official, the teniente Don Antonio Arizaga, came with his family, and he decided that his family should have chairs to sit in. And you can see chairs are very, very symbolic. And a lot of the people who lived on that street said, "Oh, yeah, we'll get some chairs for you." But he said, "No, no, no." And he went to the house of an indigenous man, Marcelo. And clearly he had, there was a plan there. And he said to this indigenous man, Marcelo, "Could you bring some chairs out for my family?" And Marcelo said, "No, this is not the customary practice," and he would not do it. So it may seem like an innocent request, but in fact, it was designed to reinforce the power differential between Spanish and indigenous officials. The right to sit and actual sitting in ritual occasions was highly regulated and part of an etiquette. Chairs played an important role in the performance of power. So in public ceremonies in New Spain, only the very highest officials, the viceroy, the bishop, the oidores, were allowed to sit. If you were, important but not as important as those people, maybe you would be allowed to sit on benches. So this is what one of the historians of New Spain, Alejandro Cañeque, calls the semiotics of power. So like the messages of power. So by demanding chairs from the indigenous official of this town in front of his house, Arizaga, the Spanish official, was trying to humiliate him. But Marcelo, by refusing, inverts the insult. So this is one of those messages that every rule of politeness or etiquette can be reversed. So Arizaga waited for the procession to go by, and then he goes into Marcelo's house and he attacks him and his sons and he arrests them, and so it gets really nasty. So this is a funny incident because generally it was people who were of the house itself that were trying to control the street. But in this case, somebody's coming from elsewhere and is trying to control what's happening in this street. So the second incident, and again, this was a very odd one. This happened in 1807 in Coyoacan. Jose Julian Romero, a man described as Español, was sitting outside his house with his family around 7 p.m. And they're just hanging out the way people did. And along comes an indigenous man who's from a nearby community called San Angel. If you've ever been to Mexico City, you'll know these are both very nice neighborhoods now. And he was basically being kind of like a tour guide, which is a funny thing. You don't think of tourism in the colonial period. But basically, his some relatives from another village had come, and he had taken them to the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and another shrine. And now he was just walking along. And so, according to the visitors, they all acknowledged the Romeros in a very polite manner. They took their hats off, and they said, "Buenas noches, adios," good night, a godly good night, basically. And then, instead of returning the salutation as you would think they would do, the Romeros answered sarcastically, and they said, "Pasen ustedes, señoritos." So, please go ahead, but they used señoritos. And now, this word señorito is a funny one. It always seems to be used seemingly in a polite way, but in a way to say, little sirs, kind of, you're not really very important. And then they also insulted them in some ways, and a brawl ensued. And so what seems to be a really simple thing turns into a big fight in which one of the men was hit on the head, and he eventually died. What was really extraordinary is the road in front of the Romero's house was actually the Camino Real. It would be like going out and blocking the highway. This was the highway of New Spain, and it was a public thoroughfare. It was supposed to be. So what right did the Romeros have to say you can't pass by? But clearly there are all these negotiations going on. I still don't entirely understand the Romero's logic, and this is one of the frustrations of a lot of judicial documents. Everybody's saying what they think the judges will want to hear, and so you get kernels of truth in there. I'm sure. At least I like to believe that, but you probably don't get the whole story. But clearly, the space in front of men's houses had to be negotiated. Okay. Surprise number 3 was about sexuality, courtship, and various things. Now, because of my sources, I thought I would only find things that would shed light on heterosexuality. Generally, a lot of the practices that are kind of on the margins of what's acceptable are in the Inquisition documents. But in fact, what I didn't realize when I started the project is that homosexuality was not prosecuted generally, but sometimes was, but not generally by the Inquisition. But what I found was that there are these protocols, these kind of, there's a kind of vocabulary of courtship and seduction. What was interesting is that there's kind of a continuum, and the ideas that are true for heterosexuality also were true for non-heterosexual courtship. So what are these codes? Well, one of the important things is this idea of prendas. So when a man decided to court a woman, and decided that they were going to marry them or wanted to marry them, they would contract what we called esponsal, sort of a betrothal, and there was always a gift. And very often these gifts, well, in the upper classes it could be jewelry, but mostly it was clothes. So clothes were actually a very important part of the economy of New Spain. In fact, I often think they were like the credit card of the time. So if you ran out of money, you'd often pawn your clothes. And some of the descriptions of bars or stores in this period was behind the counter there would be mounds of clothes that people had pawned, and they would come back and hopefully and get afterwards. So clothes had this symbolism, this economic symbolism as well. So one example is this guy called Don Juan Pablo Cancino. He was betrothed to Doña Mariana Lozano, and he said, because we are betrothed, I will begin to clothe you. So fine. Her mother died, and so he provided her with a very heavy black mourning tunic, and she found it too hot. And so she accepted another black dress or tunic from her cousin. And the original guy, Cancino, he's furious. And so why is he furious? He's furious because he felt that when another man provided clothes to his fiancée, it was an insult to his honor. So you can see how this symbolism of the prendas and the clothes was very important. But we see how this vocabulary, this language of seduction could also translate into male-on-male seduction. So in 1803, Sergeant Cristobal Sanchez got into trouble because he was very generous with low-ranking soldiers. He gave them advances on their salary, but in particular, he would give them shirts. Some of his recipients decided that we're not going to think about this too much. We want the shirts, so we'll just accept it. But others said that this meant that he was a man of irregular dealings, and so they make the assumption that he's trying to seduce them. Okay, so I think So the other thing that I found was interesting was these spaces of seduction. So one of the things that people did in order to seduce was to go out to pasear, to walk. In some Mexican villages not that long ago, at least when I went, there still is this custom of going to pasear, and so men would walk around in one way and women would walk around the other way, and then they would kind of pair off, and in some cases they'd be on horses too, and so the men would ask the woman to jump on the horse with them. So there's this idea of you go out and you look at each other, and also you are seen and so forth. So the act of pasear for the wealthy was to go to the park called the Alameda in carriages, or sometimes they would go. There were a lot of canals still in Mexico City at that point. A lot of them have been dried up. And along the side of the canals, there were a lot of places to stop and have something, a bite to eat and something to drink. And there were boats, and there was usually some music on the boats. And so this was a very common place to go. Some of these spaces took on an aura of sexuality, and they were places to seduce. A lot of the parks, in particular the Alameda, which on the surface seems like a very respectable place, it took on, it became code for seductions. The theater was another place. So these become kind of codes for seduction. So despite the fact that Don Mariano Ochoa Oscuras was actually in a monastery about to take his vows, he had a lover, and he invited her to go to the Alameda, and everybody understood that as this is seduction. So just talking about the Alameda, talking about going to the theater, these were all just codes for I'm going to try something on. The theater, it was interesting, is the theater was associated with sexuality because, not so much because of the plays, but because of the musical interludes. During the musical interludes, there were often female dancers, and men in the audience would say things like, mi alma, my soul, God keep you. And some of the actresses were also courtesans, so that just kind of created this association. but there were also other places that sort of surprised me more. So private places, so because the park and the theaters were fairly public, but some of the private places were actually kind of a bit more surprising. One was the temazcales. So these were sweat baths that go back to the Aztec period. They were often places of lewdness. The one that surprised me the most were stables, so where you kept your horses. And I think probably now, and here you have to understand, most people, unless you were very wealthy, you did not have a private bedroom. Private bedrooms did not exist. Everybody slept in the same room. And so in order to get away and do something illicit, you needed a private place. So stables were one of the places. And so, yeah, often there's just this assumption that they are going to be used for sexuality. All right. All right, so these are, yeah, some of the places. Another thing that I found really, really surprising, and this is particularly because we think of the machos being an appealing sort of man for women. And I found this one case in Cuautitlán in 1778 where a young man who is described as amujerado, who is womanly, is actually the more appealing man than his competitor, who is really imbues everything you think of as macho. So this was the macho guy was Pablo Guerrero, and the amujerado or womanly man was a guy called Josef Mendoza. So they clash, and Pablo Guerrero was always bullying Mendoza. Pablo Guerrero was this guy, he liked to ride his horse everywhere. And this was a thing, very often men, would like ride their horse into a house or into a tavern. And, it's really not really very respectable behavior, I would think. And Pablo Guerrero refused to obey local officials. He was very, very disrespectful to his elders, which is something that Mexicans found really offensive. In contrast, Josef Mendoza was described as a hard worker. He had a trade. His elders described him as quiet and peaceful. Guerrero called him, a mama's boy and a sissy, and he also started calling him Susano, which is a really weird thing. It's sort of a masculine version of Susanna, but not many women were called Susanna in the period, and I don't really understand this. Anyways, I mean, this bullying continued. And what I found really interesting is that one of the things that seems to have really set Pablo Guerrero off is that all the women liked José Susana. So they would go to these fiestas, and here you see a picture of a fiesta, and José Mendoza would buy women drinks, and they wanted to talk with him, and they wanted to be with him, and they didn't want to be with Pablo Guerrero. And I guess he just didn't understand why they didn't appreciate his manliness, and why this guy that he described as a mama's boy and so forth was being so successful. And so, we see again that this macho ideal was perhaps not the ideal for many people. Okay. Surprise number 4 was laughter, joking. As I said at the beginning, I really thought things were going to be really grim for this project. It was going to be an important project, but it was going to be grim. But in fact, I found a lot of evidence of male friendships. Men would talk about, or men would describe, yeah, they were friends. They would always go and eat lunch together. They would sit together. They would go and drink together. There was this kind of sociability. Friendship became, I think, for men, especially men who did not have a lot of power over their own lives, who were not very wealthy, it was this kind of space where they could relax and enjoy each other's company. They could operate in what the theorist James Scott calls the hidden transcript, and so they could sort of let their guard down, take off their mask. Because they were trusted allies, they would go into each other's houses. They would go out to pasear, and they would describe that. You know, they would go for a paseo with another male friend. They would play games. Things, you know, they cards, checkers. Interestingly, hopscotch, which I always associate with young children, but they would play hopscotch. So they created this sense of cohesion, and one of the ways they create this cohesion is through nicknames, and there are just tons of nicknames, and a lot of them are affectionate. There's a guy who's called El Pescadito, the little fish. Very often they're given a nickname associated with their profession, so it could be a tailor or whatever. Some of the nicknames I really didn't understand, but you know, they were kind of fun. They would play tricks on each other. They joked, and sometimes you get the sense that you only hear about these jokes and this humor when it doesn't actually work, when it's a failed joke. But you get a sense that, you know, that this is happening a lot. Even some of the clerics, and I found this rather extraordinary because I have this vision of clerics as being quite serious and so forth. But clerics were so disrespectful that the upper echelons of the church had to create rules and said, well, when they went to mass, they were not allowed to chat with each other, send each other notes, read, make jokes, pranks, or signs that would make the faithful laugh. So clearly they were also engaging in this fun. In the salons of the wealthy, we often hear about sort of failed jokes, but people sort of adopt this tone of... So people of a similar status could make jokes with each other, but they had to be very careful. So when jokes went flat, sometimes you know, they would you know, friends would fall out with other friends and so forth. I have some examples here, but I think I'm kind of going over time. If you want to hear about, you know, pranks and jokes, I can tell you about them. Okay, so this was sort of this bit of a surprise. So where did macho behavior come from? I actually think that it's part of it is this emotional composure. One of the things that I think was happening in all these ways was that there's a violence to colonialism. So colonialism can't exist without a kind of violence, even if that violence is not really seen. If it's under the surface, it doesn't mean that you have to be, you know, hitting people or attacking them or imprisoning them all the time. But there's a kind of violence there, and even within the upper ranks of society, there's always this kind of sublimation of the competition. So very, very high level officials would fight over where they would sit. So again, you know, the sitting and the chairs are very important. Whether they could take a velvet cushion to mass so they wouldn't have to sit on the hard wooden pews. I think that throughout the colonial period, you have a lot of this sort of suppression, and it's almost like there's this powder keg that's being stoked during this period. I think, okay. So in the 18th century, there was an economic boom in New Spain, but this actually meant a lot of dislocation of people. So Mexico City actually was flooded with people who had no jobs and no place to live. And there was, although there was an incredible amount of wealth, there was also an incredible amount of poverty. There was also a boom in the army, I think, but that also led to a lot of fighting between different factions of the army. And so there's a lot of tension. So in 1810, when you have the Grito de Hidalgo, and Mexicans begin to fight for their independence, all the things that were not considered to be appropriate, all the emotional composure and all this control of oneself, all those things went by the wayside. And the values that were, or the behavior that was appreciated in the armies was violence, right? And taking initiative and so forth, and all that sublimation of violence just sort of exploded. And so in my book, I talk about how Indigenous people begin to sort of turn invert the social ranking. So, for example, very often Indigenous men were insulted as perros, or dogs. That was an insult that was very much associated with Indigenous men. It was, of course, it was said by Spanish people, and they begin to call the Spanish people that, Spanish soldiers that they capture, dogs. And so they're sort of saying, okay, finally we can say what we think, so they're sort of exploding. So this is the end of the colonial peace, and it's the beginning of the age of what we call of caudillos. The caudillo is the violent man, and very often a man who we would associate with all the values of the macho. So with that, I'm going to just end here, and thank you very much for your patience and for listening.